Out. Just got finished working all day. I'm gonna go this way. All right, that's probably better. All right, so some things I want to talk about with everybody. The Northern Society, we put out our Ivan Runer book, and everything's been going really well with that. People have really been taking off with it. I'm probably going to be doing a little bit of revision on it. We kind of some of the editing process. I found a few errors and stuff like that, and there's a couple of things I want to add. And in looking at that revision, some of the stuff that we've been developing, there's been some really good conversations we've been having in regarding to some of the topics that are in the book. And one of those that has kind of been proliferate and we've been discussing a lot here lately is the hammer sign. Now, we know that there's a lot of controversy around the hammer sign because people see it as a connection to like the Christian sign of the cross, and I get that, right? And there's also the idea that the way that the sign was originally presented to people, there was just a lot of stuff added to it. I think that what people were doing was trying to see how closely the hammer sign represented, or how closely it was represented to the sign of the cross, like how they connected to one another. And the thing is, though, is that like you can't just take one conclusion and jump to another, right? So the idea is that they develop stations, and I'm sure a lot of people out there who follow this religion know that, when they do the hammer sign, it's the Odin, Balder, Freya, Thor thing, and all that stuff. We try to develop our own concept of that by looking at just Thor, at the family of Thor, and we made it Odin, Frigga, Balder, Thor. But then, like, some stuff started popping up, and we were looking at the sources closely and examining it, and it really started to form some contradictions and some problems in it. And one of those problems was that in the saga of Håkon the Good, where the hammer sign is mentioned, they also mention a sign of Odin. Now, the question then arises is, if there is a sign of Odin, why would Odin be mentioned also in the sign of Thor, in the hammer sign? Doesn't make sense, right? And so we basically just scrapped that. Like, okay, fine, it's just, once you start finding information, and it contradicts what you're doing, you got to look at it and examine it and be like, hey, this just doesn't work, But does that mean that the hammer sign isn't real or didn't exist? I think that there is some evidence to show that it possibly did exist, and that it just shared similarities with the sign of the cross, but not that it actually was, right? And the evidence that we have that it did exist is that the word Signa is found in several sources, including Sigdrifamal, and then other sagas and things like that. Egil Sagas mentions it. There's a few of them that mention this, right? And this signing is always shown in conjunction with blessing a round of the symbol, or a full, or sacrificial food, sacrificial meat, blot mat, or I think is that his word. And so it's bloat meat. So in every single instance we see this, every single time we see this connection to blessing sacred drink and food and all that stuff. So we do know that there was probably a sign, some sort of signing, that would have represented this, that would have made this this food holy, or the drink holy, right? And most of it, we don't know what it was. It may have been that each round of the symbol had its own sign or something like that, because you see there's one of Odin and there's one of Thor, and we know there's a Thor's horn and an Odin's horn mentioned in the sagas, right? But either way, in any case, the one thing though that we were seeing when things were popping up and these discussions were growing, is that some people would just come out of the woodwork and say, well, this is all Christian sources, blah, 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 Christian sources. And the same old argument you always hear. It's always Christian sources, Christian sources, Christian sources, right? And it's like, we have to really start to re-examine what that means. And I'm starting to see other scholars are doing that as well. Like Jackson Crawford's actually come out and said that he believes that the idea that all these sources are Christianized is largely exaggerated. And it's not to say that we just say, okay, well, it's Christian or something like that, or it was written down by a Christian, so we shouldn't trust it. It's not necessarily just that. It's that we should examine it. Like, how does it connect to this? How can we validate it or invalidate it? How can we prove what we're saying, right? And so, like, one of the things that we can do in favor of the sources being heathen and being polytheistic is showing like the correlations between some of the early Roman sources, such as, hey, how's it going? Some as like the Germania, Tacitus's work, the Germania, and the traditions that we find there, such as the casting of lots, which we find in, Saxo Grammaticus, Egel's Saga, and the Poetic Edda. You see sacred processions with deities on board, and, like the Nerthus procession, and then you have Frey's procession in the sagas. You see animal augury in the sagas, like Inglinga's saga mentions one. And then that's in Germania as well. I mean, you see this lineage of these traditions, and you have to realize that they're talking like almost 1,000 years apart. So there's not like Tacitus wrote this yesterday and then this guy wrote it today. It's 1,000 years apart between it, and it's really, you have to even think that they even know Tacitus, like how would they have overlapped? But the thing is there's also evidence and things that we can look at as far as the sources that we know are Christian, right? Because once we start to really examine the sources that we know are Christian or are influenced by Christianity, we can see motivation behind those things and start to develop an understanding of what Christian sources would have looked like, right? Because that's how you start to develop a theory. That's how you start to develop evidence, and that's how you start to develop arguments. Rather than just blanket saying, well, a Christian wrote this down, we just gotta ignore it, forget it, it's all lies, it's all nonsense, blah, 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 blah. Like, that's not a way to do research. That's not a way to live your life. That's not a way to do anything. It's just deconstructing. It's just not trying to form any kind of, knowledgeable opinion of anything. It's just ad hominem attack. So it's Christian, it must be lies, right? It's like, no, like we can start to discern these things, and we can start to develop theories behind them to understand exactly where they were coming from and what they were looking at and what it means to have a Christian source in your hand. Now, we have 3 examples I'm going to go over here. All right, the first one is the Solar right? Solar the Song of the Sun, right, is a poem that was written by a Christian, and in that poem he vehemently represents both polytheistic heathen ideas and Christian ideas, okay? And when he does so, these ideas they're exemplified. You see them very clearly. There are no hidden codes. There's no like, oh, it was influenced by this, or it may have represented this, or, you need these academics to meet it all out for you and show you the way and all that stuff. No, he really clearly tells you, like when he goes into the underworld, he's died, and he goes into the underworld and he speaks of the heathen underworld, and he gives all these things. He talks about Mimer and all of these different things that he sees, and he sees the Norns, and he's, connected by Hell's locks and all these different things. And you very clearly see heathen imagery in this. And then when he flips it and starts to ascend towards heaven, you see all of the Christian imagery. He talks about Jesus, talks about God, and all this stuff. It's very blatant, it's very clear, it's very concise. There's no hidden codes, there's no secrets, there's nothing that you have to have somebody else meet out for you and work it out. Oh, this connects to that, and that connects to this, and this, and that, and that. It's right there in your face. The same thing goes with the Prosetta of Snorri Sturluson. That's not one of the 3 sources I'm talking about, but because we've talked about that before. The Prosetta of Snorri Sturluson starts out, and he states right up, straight up, I'm a Christian. You shouldn't worship heathen gods. In the beginning, God created Adam and Eve, and blah blah blah. And then he goes into this Euhemerus line, and the Euhemerus school is something we have a video on elsewhere if you want to check that out on this channel. And we discussed that. All right. But you can see it, like, here it is, 2 sources right there talking about Christianity, representing Christianity, and nothing is hidden about it. There's no secrets to it. There's no hidden agenda there. They're right up, straight up. This is what it is, right? And, so those things that happen on purpose, like, you see it, and you don't have to, think about it. And when you look at the biblical school and how they broke everything down and looked at all this stuff, everything was Jesus. Balder's Jesus is because he's nice, and Odin's Jesus because he hung from the world tree, and Thor's Jesus because he fought a serpent, and everybody's Jesus, And you start to see, like, there's a pattern of kind of incontinuity there, and there's a pattern of bias that you see in all that stuff. And it doesn't represent any kind of real research. And then once the Indo-European stuff came out, a lot of those theories got discredited, and it's just, it's just nonsense. So we look at these sources and we start to understand motivations behind them. And the motivations behind them is to discredit heathenry. It's to make it look ridiculous. It's made to look stupid or archaic or barbaric or something like that, right? And so like in Solar Yod, when he's talking about the heathen underworld, you see it's like very dark, and it represents, just bad things, and it's something he's scared of, and he lives in terror, and he's just so frightened and all that stuff. And then when he goes to heaven and he sees God, everything's so wonderful and beautiful and all that stuff. And he's not describing the Christian hell, he's describing the heathen underworld. So, but it still fills him with fear, and he's showing everybody how fearful the heathen religion is, how this pagan religion is, and you should be afraid of it. And if you really want true salvation and happiness and goodness in your life, you'll become a Christian. Then you have God, and you have all this stuff in your life. That's a motivation. That's a reason to do this. There's a purpose behind it. Like, this is what you're doing. This is what I'm saying I'm doing. It's very straightforward. This is what it is. Okay. Another one that we have is the Volse Þáttr. Right now, we've been talking about Volse Þáttr on our Facebook here lately, and I really do believe that Volse Þáttr is a very important poem to our faith if you look at it correctly. Now, a lot of the academics have been telling people for years that this represents some kind of phallic cult, which is stupid. Like, there's nothing in that poem that shows anything remotely recognizable as any sort of cult, that this was something that was widespread or anything that was actually revered. And in fact, it really just seems like there's this old woman in this house, and she's kind of crazy, and she's bullying all these people, all the people in her family, to worship this horse penis, and they all don't want to, and they make fun of it, and they reject it, and they hate it, and they just think it's gross and disgusting, and they don't want to do it. And then, Olaf comes at the end, and he converts everybody to Christianity and saves the day, and everything's wonderful. Now they don't have to be bad heathens anymore, right? Obviously, that is Christian propaganda. Like, it's so easy to see this, that once you read the poem and you see that that's what's going on, you see this is propaganda. Now, I believe that this poem is taking an ancient ritual where you're sanctifying a statue, and it's turning the statue into a horse penis and then making it gross and revolting and all this stuff, right? And because we found connections to other, sources like Fridtjof Saga and Saxo and stuff like that talk about these statues in the same way that this poem describes it. But that's a whole nother video. But anyway. So when we're looking at this, we're looking at this method here, then you're seeing that the motivation behind the poem is to make the religion seem gross and vile and grotesque and something that people don't want to do, and they didn't really want to do it in the first place. There's just like these old people who forced them to, and you really want to follow the new way, which is the Christian way, and all this stuff, right? It's very blatant to see it, and you can see it right there, and you don't need anybody to mete that out, work that out for you. You just go read it, and you'll see it, and you'll be like, oh yeah, you totally can see that, okay? Another one is, and this one isn't quite as obvious, but it does connect to some other texts that we have. This came about later. I'm thinking like the Malleus Maleficarum, where the witch's hammer. Some of the ideas that later developed in Christianity, where they started taking things that they felt were like devil worship or evil or things like that, and they started taking things and making them just look ludicrous and absurd and just like over the top, crazy, weird sounding. And they would take a lot of Christianity and just invert it. That's where the whole idea of like an inverted cross comes from, and people reading the Bible backwards and, walking backwards around. I mean, just the whole thing was always like an inversion or an absurdity, right? And this is a passage in Cormac's saga, right? And I'm going to read this to you. I wrote it down. He who made it ready. We're talking about this Tjóðsnabót. Sorry, it's a passage where they're going to do a battle rite. They're going to basically perform a holmgang, and in that they're going to perform the Tjóðsnabót, right? And the Tjóðsnabót is basically like a battle bloat, okay? It says, he who made it ready should go to the pins, which are called Tjóðsnir, in such a manner that he could see the sky between his legs, holding the lobes of his ears, and speaking the 4 words used in the rite called Tjóðsnabót. Now, you imagine a guy like with his head between his legs, holding his earlobes. I mean, that's kind of ridiculous. That sounds absurd. That sounds like somebody making a fool of themselves. And that's the idea behind it. That this is an old pagan practice, and we know that they were all weirdos and crazy people, and that they just did weird things. So obviously, we have another example of something that's more than likely propaganda, more than likely showing people that this is a ridiculous religion, you shouldn't practice it anymore, and there's some definite bias in that and concepts of that, and there's nothing anywhere that shows any correlation to anything that's being said there. Unlike in some of the other, other texts and stuff like that, when you find mentions of like bloat bowls and oath rings and sacrifice and bloat and stuff like that, you can find it consistent throughout many, many sources, and they stretch back throughout antiquity, right? And so you can find those lines of that, whereas this is a completely isolated passage. There's nothing that connects to anything else anywhere of anybody doing anything like this, and and it's just trying to make them look silly, So if you have a basis by which you look at these things and you start to understand how it works, right? And what a Christian text looks like. This is what it looks like. Then you can start to see that these other texts that don't look anything like that probably are not Christianized texts, right? And we should start taking them more seriously and start examining them closer and start understanding the language that was spoken. And because the biggest problem with all of this stuff is that the idea that all the sources are Christian has just become an excuse, and a lot of New Agers took a hold of that and started making the religion whatever they wanted it to be, and they just go with whatever they want, and it's all about their feelings and what the emotions that they want out of this religion and all that stuff, and not what the religion actually is. Not try to actually define it, not try to form a basis for it, but just do whatever you want to. A lot of people have sold a lot of books doing that and representing just whatever they want, and a lot of it's like impiety and counterculture concepts and postmodernism and all that stuff, and it's not what this religion is, And so like when people hear you talk about piety or devotion, they think that you're just being a Christian. Oh, I'm sorry, you have this Christian baggage, and it's like, no, this is what is in the sources. And you just don't like that, and because you don't like it, you think that it's not there or that it's Christianized. Well, prove it. Base your argument on evidence. Give us a strong argument. Show us how it doesn't work that way. But no one ever really has, because it's just not the case. The case of it is that we can discern what is Christian propaganda, and we can differentiate that from what is actual heathen practice that was recorded by people who were simply trying to preserve the history of their ancestors, who had learned things from their grandparents. They may have converted, but they still had family members who were involved in this. They still had people that they knew and cared about who were involved in it. It didn't happen, the conversion didn't happen overnight and they just killed everybody like some people think. It happened over a gradual period of time. And so they preserved the history of this and the knowledge of this, and they helped people to understand what it was like to live in that heathen era. And then we are able to take that and sort of see all the pieces that have been left behind and rebuild that and understand it better and gain greater knowledge from it by not living by those excuses, but actually living by a standard and a prerequisite behind what we do, to make sure that we know that when we build these things, we're building with strong arguments, we're building it with connections from one source to another, and that we're actually on firm footing. All right? So, that's what I have to say on that, and I really appreciate everybody listening. I think that this is a very important topic for us all to be discussing, right? And the number one thing that you want to do is if you're talking about this stuff, if you're in a group of people and you're talking about this stuff, stand your ground, make these people prove what they say. Because if you do, you're going to see them get really mad, right? But they're never going to be able to prove what they say, and that's really why you see, like, if anybody's watched the debates the Northern Society's been in, I mean, that's what happens, the people get really mad at us because we won't back down. We're not going to be like, oh, okay, well, you said that it's all Christian, so I don't want to be called a Christian, so I'm going to give up and just quit and walk away, And we don't do that. We're like, no, prove it. Make your case. Build your argument. If you can't build your argument, if it's just a bunch of anger and emotion and innuendo and nonsense and connecting the dots between 15 million things, then it's not an argument. You're not doing anything. You're just speaking in the wind. So always give yourself a firm foundation. Always give yourself a place where you can say, okay, I can understand how this is this, right? Like, this is a Christian source. This is their motivation behind it. This is their purpose behind it. But this over here doesn't seem to have that. So where do you get this idea? And, a lot of this stuff, I mean, we found out that a lot of these Christians were making these things out and they were adding evidence to it. Like, there was this whole thing about the Irish in Iceland and all this stuff, and that they got a lot of stuff from this Irish monastery. But then they found out that some of the books that they were using weren't even around at the time that these poems were put together and all this stuff. And it's just adding things and adding things and adding things until it's just totally indiscernible. And so you want to make sure that you're looking at this objectively and you're understanding the arguments that are being made and you're building upon it. All right. So I appreciate everybody listening. check out our book, the Ivan Runer book. I think you're going to learn a lot from it. You know, like I said, I'm gonna be doing a few revisions. It's not gonna be anything major, just gonna be some cool little additions and, you know, just some cleanup we're gonna do. All right. So everybody have a good night. Hail the gods.